Shalom, everyone. Welcome back to another Wednesday night. This is a different kind of a night. I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading scriptures. I'm going to talk about something that will lead me into modern science. And so for this, my topic is 6 millennia, learning through time. And we're going to be talking about science and religion. And the topic came about because I oftentimes go through YouTube, and I don't know how many of you know DeRossi Tyson, who is a astronomer, a famous astronomer right now. Anyway, Neil is his first name. And going through it, the whole lesson was the fact that he didn't believe in God, and which struck me. Not because he didn't believe in God. I understood that, but he was in Australia, and that's where he was talking to this audience. And the audience filled an entire lecture hall. I mean, it was 400 or 500 people there. It was not a very small lecture, which drove me to the computer, and I began to look up science and atheists. I found out that Great Britain has the fifth most atheists in the world. Australia has the seventh most atheists in the world. By atheists, that means that they profess to the fact that they do not believe there is a God. In fact, there was a lot of things going on that were very troubling. But anyway, I started looking up, and I decided, well, what's it like in the United States? Because I know in the United States, we seem to be losing what people call Christians, no longer being Christian. So in looking it up, I went to the Pew survey. It was 2021 was the year in which the survey was done. And what it said was it was extremely difficult to get all of the information. I had to work around and come to some conclusions by myself. But most Americans profess to the belief in God, 83%. And 82% said that they had some relationship with the religious events. In other words, I'm assuming that means Christmas cookies and Easter bunnies and all of those other kinds of things, or their parents were involved with it, but they don't all go to church. In fact, that was a thing that bothered me. While I was a principal, I spent a month and a half in Japan as part of an exchange program. I took 3 high school kids over there from Mishawaka. And we got over there, and the point was to learn their culture and to become absorbed in their culture. Well, part of the problem is when we came to the questioning part. All 3 of them said they were Roman Catholic, which was pretty obvious. We have 4 Catholic churches in our town. But then I asked them, well, when was the last time you were in church? And they said, I don't ever remember being in church. But you're Roman Catholic? Yeah, that's what my mom and dad told me. I'm Roman Catholic. As it goes further along, we ended up going to these different Shinto shrines. We went to the Buddha shrines. And then we were given a sheet and asked to compare Catholicism to Buddha, to Shinto, to the religions of the East. And none of them had any clue. They had never been in a church, so they don't even know what the church looked like on the inside. They just know that they're Roman Catholic. So I struggled with that. But then I went back and I kept looking in records, and I found out that just a third, 33%, say that they believe in God, while only another 18%, they believed in some sort of higher power or spiritual entity of some sort. While 41% said they didn't believe in either one of them. Now, these are our scientists that are understanding everything that's going on. And from our perspective, many of you already know that we study the Torah and we find science in the Torah. But that didn't seem to hold with the survey. Now, according to 2021, a narrow majority of the U.S. public, 51%, tell us that they're Protestant. By that, they mean they're Christian. And about 24% say that they're Catholic. And so the ratio is about 2-1. But anyway, as I was going through, I found out that, again, affiliation and actually going, when we talk about 51%, only 20% go to church regularly for the Protestants, and only 10% go regularly for the Catholics. Then I kept looking, and there's science. I found this column that said science. In the United States, 20% of all scientists are atheists. 17% have no, well, 20% say that there's nothing in particular in the air. There's no spirit. 17% say they are atheists. 11% will tell you that they're agnostic. Well, look how much of a percentage that is. Now, we find, as we're going through the texts of the Torah, we find ourselves finding scientific ideas, things that would tell us that there is an order, a natural order that goes with things. And then I wondered even more. I asked myself, what about men and women? Well, according to the article, 44% of the men, 36% of the women do not believe in God. That's the scientists. So there's a little more men that don't believe than women. But then it took me back to a scripture that I'd been reading in the book of Proverbs, and it says, the source of life is the wisdom of study. And I began to wonder, what study are they talking about? Now, I remember last week I talked with you guys about the idea of the water above from the water below. And I'm beginning to understand really what that's really talking about. Human wisdom versus godly wisdom. The wisdom that you and I are presenting to ourselves over and over again. The wisdom of God from Torah versus the wisdom of man and what it leads to. Now, there's another scripture, Mishnah Avot 5:22. It says that one should deeply study the Torah, for it contains everything. Everything. So I began to think about it, and I began to go through my books and all of the other things, and I came to some articles and some understandings. There was a Jewish astronomer physician. His name was Rabbi Shmuel Yarhoni. Anyway, he was famous in astronomy, but he was more famous because of his medicine. He was the personal physician of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who was the one who who developed the Mishnah. He was, Rabbi Yehuda was actually a great-grandchild of the King David. Now, he was a famous rabbi, but he was beginning to have problems with his eyesight. So Rabbi Shmuel created a medicine to give to him, but the medicine couldn't be just simply laid upon the eye. It had to be put inside the eyeball. Now, this is the 2nd century CE, the 2nd century. He created a hypodermic needle. Now, the hypodermic needle is not going to be used until the 19th century. Imagine 1700 years ahead of his time, he had already created a hypodermic needle. Now, he went to give it to Rabbi Yehuda, but the rabbi says, no, not me. And he says, well, how about a paste? No, not that either. So he created a port in Rabbi Nassi's neck, and he inserted the medicine into the port. What century did we ever begin using ports in medicine? This is the 2nd century. Galileo, remember, was famous for the telescope. But again, back in that 2nd century, Rabbi Gamaliel, actually this is the 1st century, created a cylinder that he could look through, and he could see 2/3 of a mile away clearly. The beginnings of a telescope. But what was more important was the fact that this telescope that he had created, or this focal point, was able to look down into a ravine and tell you how deep the ravine was, or to look up at a tree and tell you how tall the tree was. First century. Besides that, I found other places in science that talk about such a thing. There was a man named Rabbi Joshua, first century again, great scholar. In fact, he was totally amazing. Again, his fields of study were astronomy and biology. Now, I haven't talked with any of the rabbis regarding what their particular science was that they studied when they were in school, or if they did. I know when I was back north, we had our rabbi back there was a physicist as well as a rabbi. That was how he could support himself as he was going through the whole process. But this rabbi was so smart, he was so full of wisdom that they called him the Great Beauty because of his wisdom. The only problem was he was the ugliest man ever. He was not beautiful in any way, shape, or form. In fact, he would go over to the Roman governor's house, and as he's sitting there talking with the governor and they were discussing science, the daughter would come in and she'd say, "How can somebody as smart as you be as ugly as you?" Beauty's evidently was only skin deep. Rabbi Rambam, Rabbi Maimonides, he was about 1,000 years ago, lived in the third millennium. And very interesting about him was the fact that he was not only a Torah scholar who wrote the Guide to the Perplexed, but he was also the physician for Pharaoh. He found himself oftentimes praying, "God, may I study Torah more than I love being a physician," where he was coming from. Now, in the book of Genesis, my favorite chapter in Genesis is Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1:1 begins, "Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim vet haaretz." Doesn't mean much on the Hebrew side. We would read it normally. But if you read the Hebrew side, you would find that there is many secrets that are there. Many of them. One of the secrets is the fact that there are 6 alephs in that sentence. Now, aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The fact that there are 6 of them, and we're talking about the days of creation, the commentators have understood that these 6 alephs represent the first 6 days. But aleph can also be interpreted as Aleph. Same letter, it's just a different pronunciation. Aleph means 1,000. So 1,000 then could be speaking to the number of years that our people have left on this planet, 6,000 years. In fact, there are scriptures that would, if you go to the Sanhedrin 97a, it begins by saying the world's duration is 6,000 years, as the verse says. God alone will be exalted on that day. And it says, for 1,000 years are in your eyes like one day. Now, if our natural laws hold true, we have 6,000 years. Science lives in the world of nature. Do you realize that if we're talking about the first verse of Genesis 1, we're talking about natural things, nature. The word for nature has the same numeric value as the word for God in that first sentence. Some of us would study nature, some of us would study God. God would have us study both. Now, next week, I want to get into some things that are changing in science very quickly. But right now, I want to just focus particularly on the earliest understandings of science and where science fits. But I want to use the Bible too. So I'm going to take you millennium by millennium through probably 4 of them tonight. Do 5 and 6 next week, part 2. because I want to give you the understanding that there are several facets to each millennium. There's a Torah facet, there's a science facet. Now, in the first millennium, going from first year of creation, or the first day of creation, through the year 1000 of creation, is the first millennium. Now, in the first millennium, we're going to deal with things like, well, if you ever read the book of Job, and that's what I've been studying lately, was the book of Job. In Job chapter 38, verse 20, it begins by asking the simple question, have you ever seen the treasures of the snow? Took me a while to understand what that meant. In fact, I went to the commentaries to come up with my own understanding. What's unique about snow is the fact that every snowflake is different. But we never realized that until we actually put a microscope to it. The treasures of snow. Job 38:16 tells us something very amazing, the fact that there are springs in the bottom of the sea. Man never knew there were springs there until we began to go deep diving. And then we found out the fact that as we go down deeper, we find these scalding hot waters coming through the Earth's crust, and with them also minerals are being pushed to the surface. In Job 40, chapter 40, verse 15 to 24, it talks about animals that ate out of the tops of the trees, dinosaurs. Genesis chapter 17, verse 14 speaks of the eighth day when a male baby should be circumcised. Understanding that on the eighth day, the blood has the greatest ability to coagulate, and the body's immune system is at its peak. It decreases from then until we die. It was in 1864 that we could understand that God asked Job, can you send out lightning in the form of a message that can save you? That's from God. Today, we can understand that lightning is actually electricity, and electricity can be sent in the form of radio waves, and in essence, can give us speech. So many times we read the text and we read through, but God has placed a great amount of information there. Human knowledge and wisdom have been wrapped up oftentimes in legends and myths. But the Bible gives you many of those same lessons in a very different form. The Vilna of Gaon used to tell his disciples that they were all to study for human knowledge, or to understand human knowledge. But he said there's only going to be three things that will progress. One is Torah, one is music, and the other is mathematics. Those are the only three that are going to, I will skip that. So let's get into the first millennium. Adam almost lives through the entire thing. 970 years of his life will be spent going through this whole process of understanding. Understanding will come to him the first night when he all of a sudden understands that he needs a fire. Understanding comes from all of the ways that he will manage to survive. Most of us understand that Adam probably was a hunter-gatherer. Not that he hunted animals, but yet he had to search for his food because of an inability or lack of understanding of farming methods. Now, there were some farming, but farming was much more difficult in the days of Adam. In fact, we know that Cain grew vegetables, and we also knew that Abel was the one who herded sheep. Both of them lived off of an agricultural kind of basis. Now, in the days of Adam, God established 6 basic laws. Today we have 7. That's called the Noahide laws, and the 7th one will be given to us with Noah in the second millennium. But there's 7 laws that permeate what we are supposed to be about. things that we should do, not do. Those are our way of looking at things. Now, the greatest character in that first millennium was Enoch. Enoch, remember, was the one who spent 65 years. Then he went 300 years, and then he was taken. Now, some say at the end of 65 years, he had been with an angel, and the angel explained to him what was about to happen. Because you see, he named his son very strangely. He named his son Metzulah. Metzulah. When he dies, it shall come. And it did. 7 days after the passing of Methuselah, the deluge started. Now, as we're going through this understanding, remember Enoch, his name means educate, or to dedicate. Now, Cain had a son, and he called his son's name Enoch, to educate. Cain changed the way things were in the world. You see, Cain went and became educated because he was responsible for building the first city. And if you follow Cain's family line, you will find out that the musicians are there, that there are lots of ways in which they performed in a city kind of situation, where Seth was, again, a sheep herder moving through that. Now, while in the Garden of Eden, Adam had contact with an angel, according to the book of Enoch, and according to the book called the Book of Ra'azel. Ra'azel was an angel who came down and began to spend time with Adam, trying to help him survive, guiding him through that first millennium. As we move through that whole understanding, we have to come to the understanding that that millennium comes to an end. And before it completely ends, at the year 987 after the creation, at that point in time, Enoch no longer walks on this earth. In fact, the legends have it, and the stories have it in the Talmud, that he becomes Metatron. God turns him into an angel. And now he spends his time as second in command. The first millennium ends with the millennial flood. The flood was something that was caused in which we had the characters having to survive. And so Noah was the righteous man in whom God trusted, and Noah developed scientific skills. You see, Moses will be later, but Moses doesn't invent anything, doesn't build anything. But Noah, on the other hand, builds an ark. An ark, 300 by 50 by 75. Value of those letters creates the word teva, which is ark. But teva is also a speech. God, through Noah, created speech that would create for him an ark. Now, he built the ark probably out of reeds, because according to the Quran, the ark was built at the north end of the Dead Sea, where the reeds were growing plentifully at that point in time. He goes through the process of building this ark. The family themselves, again, there's no saving them in the sense that the world is becoming worse and worse. But the scripture from the Zohar talks about the fact all the well springs of the abyss erupted and the windows of heaven were opened. Zohar is really speaking about water coming from below. Great amounts of water. Science has now learned that many rocks below the surface actually contain water, hold water. As we go through, we begin to understand Noah straddles he was in the first millennium, now he's in the second millennium, when he will finally pass away at the age, and it'll be the year 2006 when he dies. But as after his death is when we begin to see that man begins to change strategies. Enoch, remember, had built the first city. Nimrod and company began to build the first tower. Now, the tower was called a ziggurat, according to the Aramaic language. A ziggurat is simply a tall structure, usually used for worship. And again, the concept behind the ziggurat was the fact that they were going to build something so tall that the flood would never flood it. That was their goal. It wasn't ever achieved, but that was their goal. Science was moving along. But at the same time, God was beginning to call out one boy. From an early age, he called out Avram. Avram, from the beginning, should never have lived because Nimrod wanted to have him killed, executed. In fact, he sent his leading magician out to find him and kill him. His leading magician happened to be Abraham's father. But Abraham lived, and Abraham grew up. Abraham went through many trials. And at the age of 75, God had taken him all the way out of the land of Ur, out of the land of Haran. And he was now out in the open, and God showed him the stars in the sky. Now, Abraham knew the stars in the sky. You see, astrology was a tremendous source of blessing to the people because they could understand what was coming, what was happening, why things happened. That was part of it. In fact, the whole thing started with this third son of Adam, Enosh, or his grandson. You see, Enosh was the character who happened to, well, he didn't lead the people. And they all began to find that God was too busy because they couldn't raise him on the telephone. And so they began to go and look for other ways to reach God. And so they found the stars, and they began to use the stars as a intermediary. Hasn't changed much. We sometimes substitute people for that, but that's pretty much the same story. Abraham finally went out one night. God took him out under the stars, and he says, Abraham, look up. What you see, that number of stars, that's how many children you will have. But God, I don't have any children. You will. And your name isn't going to be Abraham then, or Abram then. It's going to be Avraham, because you're going to be the father of many nations. Now, again, by coincidence, in 1948, Abraham was born. What year did Israel become a nation? Is there a coincidence? Could the age of Abraham at his death, which will reach, well, you can do the math. Back to the story. Abraham was brilliant in many things. In fact, he wrote the first, what the Jews called their own book. It's called the Sefer Yetzirah. It's called the Book of Formations. You see, he knew linguistics and he knew the stars. He understood that there were 32 paths of wisdom, the 22 letters of the alphabet, and what he called the 10 Sephirot. And using those, he wrote a book to explain scientifically in his day where they should be headed and how they will get there. Abraham led his nation through conversation, not through war, but conversation. Now, the second millennium ends. Obviously, we had Jacob, we had Isaac, we had lots of characters. But the third millennium, that's the difficult one. In fact, it's called by the Jews themselves the Dark Ages. They call it the collapse of the Bronze Age. Those are the two titles that they give it. Now, again, it deals with the idea of theology and the idea of philosophical beliefs. Now, it was in the year 2448. Two great events occurred that year. Both of them were tied to one man, Moshe. You see, in that year, Israel was allowed to leave the land of Egypt. And in that year, they arrived at Mount Sinai. And arriving at Mount Sinai, they found themselves, well, blessed to not only hear, but to see the words of God. You see, the first two commandments were written in the heavens. They could see God's words. Now, how could that happen? That's next week's lesson. As we're going through this whole idea, we have to understand that Sinai was a significant point because now we had some written records, some written information, which led us to understanding some scientific principles. But it led us to other places because you see the stories there were not only just stories, but they were also metaphors. They were also allegories. They were also giving us lessons and teaching us things that we needed to understand. Our science in that third millennium was the science of understanding God and how to live with God. Now, as things moved along, from the Torah perspective, things became odd. Wisdom was in the nations at the end of the third millennium, when a character came along whose name was Shlomo ben David, Solomon, son of David, who was seen as being the wisest man who ever lived, who understood, and if you look at his books, the book of Proverbs, the book of Song of Songs, the book of Ecclesiastes, you find written there many scientific principles, many things that people would begin to look at. David, his father, had written so many Psalms. In fact, he had talked about the rivers in the sea, pathways by which ships could move more easily from place to place. That wasn't found until almost the 17th century, when they began to map out the currents in the oceans. We begin to look at things a little bit differently. Solomon has a temple. The temple is the most magnificent structure that was supposedly ever created. It was never duplicated in the second temple, but it was astounding as a first temple. Solomon's wisdom really captured the attention of all the artisans, because as they were working on their structure, it was by far the most beautiful thing that had ever been created. But at the same time, there seemed to be some sort of magic working there. There seemed to be some sort of, the masterpiece really might have been not even in the temple, but in the palace. You see, he had those same artists build him a throne. The throne had 6 steps that led up to the seat. Each of the steps had animals carved onto the sides. And by the way, the seats were, the throne was ivory. The animals themselves were made out of various stones that had been carved and shaped. Solomon could walk up the steps and sit down, and he had 2 chairs, one on either side, each side of him. On the one chair would have been the high priest. On the other chair would have been what they called the Saran. He was the associate high priest. He would be sitting in the other chair. Now, when he passed away, and in fact, when the country was taken by force by Egypt, back in the days of Josiah, the the chair went down to Ptolemy, down in Egypt. He attempted to climb up the steps, but he got no higher than the first step because the lion that was on the side of the step mauled his leg and broke it. And he never did sit in the seat of Solomon. Well, Babylon ended up taking the chair and moved it to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar tried to climb the chair, and lo and behold, he got no farther than the first step also. He was beaten and knocked to the ground. Darius the Mede had the chair moved to Media. Lo and behold, as he first climbed the first step, he too could not get above the first step. And finally, it ended up with Ahasuerus. You remember Ahasuerus, Esther's husband? He tried to climb it. He again was beaten. And he never tried to climb it again, but he had his men make him a chair exactly like it. And that was the chair that he sat in. The other chair was just simply put into a holding place at that point in time. Ivory, magic, lots of things happened in those 6 steps. Now, as we're going through this, understand that there was a great number of things were happening. And one of the most artistic things that happened in the 2nd century that moved to the 3rd was the menorah. The menorah had 7 branches on it. A new one was created during the days of Solomon, in which the 7 menorah branches had engraved on it also the names of 7 scientists or men who had wisdom. He also had made for himself, Solomon did, 70 chairs for the 70 workers or the 70 Sanhedrin members that he had. The ark, again, all of the things that he had, magic, according to the world. But as we go on down through this whole thing, we find out that Solomon was the one who's going to eventually carry the title, or his title will be passed on to Solomon, the son of David. Because you see, he was the first one called the son of, and the last one will be called the son of David. That's who we're waiting for. Isaiah or Zohar 2:85a describes Solomon's reign metaphorically. He says it a time in which the moon's blemish, its waxing and waning, was repaired. Solomon would become a perfect example of the future messianic figure. Can you imagine there was no waxing or waning of the moon during the reign of Solomon? Now, if the moon is not waxing and waning, how on earth, what did they see? Now, if you go back to the book of Genesis, that same first chapter, and you go to day 4, you find out that God created 2 great luminaries, one to rule the day and one to rule the night. Now, as the story goes on, one of the luminaries said, "How can there be 2 kings?" To which God said, "You're right, we'll make one small." And so he turned to the moon and he says, "You need to be small." And so the moon was shrunk. But in the world to come, the sun and the moon will both be the same size. 4th millennium. This was the millennium with the 2 great temples again. But following the footsteps of Solomon was Ezra. Ezra was the scientist of this group. Ezra had this great scholarship. Ezra was the great writer. He wrote the entire book of Chronicles. He also was said to have written the book of Malachi. He was the great Sofer. He was the great script maker. Now, in this whole process, what was going on at the same point in time was that they began to compile the notes and the thoughts and sayings of all the sages. Ezra was the one who was participating in that. It was completed, as I told you before, by Hanasi, Yehuda Hanasi, but it was started here. And so we began to collect what would be later called the Talmud, the oral Torah, all of the information gathered, all the scientific notes that are not simply reported easily in the Bible, but are found within there. Now, among those scholars that were there was a dumb hick. At the age of 40, he was an Edomite. At the age of 40, he finally found a woman who would marry him, who happened to be the daughter of the richest man in the country, who eventually disowned his daughter. For 40 years, he just simply worked with the sheep. But then his wife began to teach him Torah. And he began to learn, and he learned so well that he became the sage of sages. His name was Rabbi Akiva. Now, he continued, and as he did, he explained that all the rabbis, all the sages needed to know these things. They needed to understand astronomy, astrology, zoology, biology, medicine, and the major theories regarding fire, wind, air, and water. Even Plato's thinking was part of the Talmud. Even that became part of the story. Science has always been part of the Torah. Science has not always been a part of man's search for God. Over the next 2 millennia, we're going to watch them come closer to one another. But then they'll pass in the wind and we'll come back and start all over again. But what I'm trying to get at is the fact that the Bible is key to understanding God, but it's also key to understanding the sciences, to truly know what's going on, to truly understand. And so that will be the focus, because you see, the final understanding is now being brought to the forefront. Energy, frequency, and vibration. All of those were found in the very first chapter of the book of Genesis. Energy, frequency, vibration. That's enough for tonight. And it's probably a lot of boring stuff, but I just wanted to give you a taste of Torah, a taste of science, to lead me into next week, which will lead me into 2 weeks after that. But I want you to have a basic understanding of where we're going with this. It's not the typical Torah study that I would like to give, but right now it's, I guess, is important for me to lay the groundwork for where I'm going as before we get there. So thank you for listening to me. You can keep your stones in your own house because you can't throw them through the computer window anyway. But anyway, thank you for staying with me the whole time. I didn't see anybody leave me. You all hung around till the very end. I don't know if you have any questions or any thoughts that you want to talk about.